Hello and welcome to our first program of 2022. I'm Stephanie Gaspar, President of Kissimmee Valley Audubon Society, and appreciate everyone watching. I want to give a special thanks to Deborah Green for joining us in November to talk about the caterpillar connection and how essential these critters are for bird populations. If you haven't seen the program yet, be sure to check it out on our YouTube channel. I have a few chapter announcements as well. Due to COVID, our general meetings will still be online, and our board will continue to monitor the situation. When things are safer, we are excited to resume face-to-face meetings. The same goes for field trips. We usually have our Merritt Island field trip every January, but it was postponed this month. So please stay tuned for any details about upcoming field trips this spring. Additionally, last month our chapter was proud to dedicate a beautiful handcrafted bench to Peggy and Denny Choley. It's currently at the Disney Wilderness Preserve on the Hardin Trail, so if you are ever out there, take a seat and enjoy the views. Both Peggy and Denny contributed so much to our chapter and were greatly involved in bird conservation efforts, and it was an honor for us to know them. Finally, we are currently looking for board members, so please contact us if you are interested. No experience is necessary, and we look forward to having diverse members of our growing community involved. Our email is in the description below, so please reach out if you or someone you know is interested. Before we begin, I would like to mention a few housekeeping items. Log into YouTube if you have any questions and type them in the chat. The questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. I'm happy to introduce tonight's guest, Dr. Paul Gray. Paul has been working in Florida for 30 plus years, with the last 26 for Audubon. He works on water, land, and bird management issues primarily related to Lake Okeechobee, but works on statewide issues too. He is a charter member of the Florida Grasshopper Sparrow Working Group and co-chair of the Snail Kite Coordinating Committee. Tonight, Paul will cover the discovery of American birds by early naturalists, the plundering of American birds by market hunters, poachers, crackers, and even scientists, and the evolution of the Audubon movement to protect birds. The Audubon struggles are more than 100 years old and continue to this day. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Paul. I will now pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in tonight. As Stephanie said, I've been working for Audubon for it'll be 27 years in a month or so. And I'm an ecologist by training, but I'm not a historian, but I'm going to cover a lot of history just because it's kind of a hobby of mine to look at how people learn birds. Because when we go bird watching, we have these really sophisticated field guides that tell you what all the birds are and what their range is and how the male and female works. But if you think about the first people that got to America, there was no field guide. I mean, no one had cataloged American birds. So it's always been kind of interesting to me to how people figured out what we had here and what we didn't. So I'll talk about the discovery of birds, then I'll talk about the beginning of the Audubon movement in the late 1800s, and then I'll morph to my program, the Lake Okeechobee program, and kind of talk about what we're doing now. So with that, we're off. I think we're off. Okay, so back in some people call it the age of discovery, when Europeans got pretty good sailing ships in the 1400s, and they started going down around the Horn of Africa and going to Africa and reached India. And then, of course, Christopher Columbus in 1492 set out across the Atlantic and found North America. When those ships set out, they always had scientists on them. They were merchant ships, and so they would always put someone on there who was a scientist who could describe what they found, because the companies were looking for riches. You know, they were looking for trees that they could cut down, or good agricultural districts, or they were looking for, mining where they get gold and silver. And so the naturalists on board had to report back, here's the resources of the area. They also reported the different kinds of wildlife. They also reported on the indigenous people. Because obviously if you want to go take stuff away, you have to deal with them. And unfortunately, we have a bad thing. But so that's why, Charles Darwin was one of these early naturalists on a sailing ship. And he wasn't put on there to go discover evolution. He was put on there to go catalog everything that they found. And another famous scientist was George Steller of the Steller Sea Cow and the Steller's Jay. He was on Bering's ship when they came from Russia and they went to Alaska. So anyway, these guys were out there. They were trying to figure out what's going on. So here's some early American drawings. And these are two different books from two different guys. You notice the similarity? There weren't a lot of prints about American birds. And so they would plagiarize each other all the time. So the first pretty good book was by Mark Catesby. And if you look at a bullfrog, its name is Rana catesbiensis. And he wrote a pretty good book about North American birds and plants and some of the animals. And so he had about 109 bird species. And remember, North America has about 800 bird species. So he got a pretty good start. And, you know, this is a pretty good print for back in the 1700s. This is just another bird. Notice this is the Carolina parakeet, and they're extinct now. So he introduced Europeans to a lot of the American birds, or at least some of the first ones. There is a Frenchman, George Louis Leclerc, and he was a very famous cataloger and very, very prolific writer and cataloger. So he actually was not a field person. He just lived in Paris and he was at a museum or something. And so when these ships would come back, he would get their whatever they brought back, whatever specimens, and he would catalog them and write about them. And he had a lot of mistakes because some of the ships, they didn't have the stuff labeled. He would not know what continent some birds came from, and he'd put them on the wrong continent and stuff like that. But he was one of the first people who was really making images of these things and trying to catalog them. And so he was in the 1700s. And the next guy I'm going to talk about was Alexander Wilson. And the funny thing about Buffon was he was French, and he had this idea that everything in France was perfect and everything else in the world was some degraded form, you know, kind of European centric stuff. And so he wrote about American birds that they were degraded versions of European birds. And Alexander Wilson it drove him nuts. As a matter of fact, Thomas Jefferson, when he was over in France with Benjamin Franklin, he got so mad about that type of condescending attitude that he had someone shoot a moose and send it to France so they could see we had the biggest antelope in the world, or elk, or whatever group he's in. So anyway, so Wilson actually was our first really good ornithologist, and he did this all on his own. He identified 268 species of the 348 available in the eastern United States. He never made it west of the Mississippi River. And he died prematurely. He died when he was only about 49. But he did a really good job of illustrating the birds, describing their behavior. This is one of his prints from his book. I bought it for this wonderful bird, the grasshopper sparrow, but I had to pay extra money because I had these little show-offs up here. But anyway, he did a really good job. And if one of the things that he really did was he could draw the birds fresh. And so if you look at Buffon's bird, when he got this skimmer, that bird had probably been dead for months. And so the soft colors were faded and he couldn't really get their colors. And he also couldn't see the bird standing. You know, he just had a dead bird. So he often had funny poses, bad colors. And so you notice in Wilson's skimmer, he's got the orange legs and the red bill. And really Buffon did not have a chance to do that. And so one of the things that he would do, this is down in the bottom corner of his painting. This says "Drawn from Nature" by Alexander Wilson. And so that was a really big thing to him. He would say, I drew this from nature, so therefore it's more accurate than any drawing you ever got in history. And if you're wondering if you've heard of Alexander Wilson, what kind of snipe do we have? Wilson's snipe, Wilson's phalarope, Wilson's warbler, Wilson's storm petrel, Wilson's plover. There are more North American birds named after Alexander Wilson than any other person because he was one of the first people. And he was a really good scientist. His art was not what John James Audubon's art was. You notice like with these hooded warblers, the tail is turned sideways because he's trying to give you identifying marks. Here's another extinct bird that he drew. So anyway, he did just a really good job at American birds, and he sorted out, like he figured out the orioles. You think about some of the orioles, the males and the females, of course, are different color. And then the first year male is different pattern than the second year male. And then when they're molting in between drab and bright plumages, you get all kinds of variations. And so the people who tried to identify orioles were just had a mess. They had all these different species, which really were all the same Oriole. And he would actually keep them in cages and watch their molt sequence. And so he learned how to sort out the Orioles. And so his work is famous for actually being really error-free. I mean, he had mistakes, but there weren't very many. Well, then along came John James Audubon about 20 years later. And Audubon was first and foremost an artist. He was a French origin. He, very flamboyant, very beautiful drawings and very beautiful birds. And that really captured the imagination of a lot of people because he just depicts the birds so radiantly. And his book was huge. This is an actual book. And what he was trying to do was draw every bird life size. And so this had to be this big because if you try to draw a white pelican, you can't get it on a page very easy if you draw it life size, or even a great blue heron. And so that's part of the reason why some of his birds, like pelicans and herons, were so strangely positioned, because in order to fit it on the page, you had to have the bird in some contorted position. But obviously this is not a field guide, but he did get about 400 birds, and he went out west. And remember, Wilson was in 240 or something, but he went out west, and so he got to see a lot of birds that Wilson never had a chance to get to. But then this became the standard for American birds. And again, just really dramatic drawings. And here's a swallowtail kite eating prey in the air like they are wont to do. And Audubon had pressure on him because Wilson was so famous that sometimes he couldn't find some of the birds that Wilson found, but he wanted to include them anyway. So notice how similar this Mississippi kite is to this one. It's reversed. And there's quite a few birds that Audubon had to poach from Wilson because he never actually got to see one. Okay, so that was the 1830s. And then by the 1850s, we started getting a whole lot of people interested in birds and identifying birds. An interesting thing happened is that Spencer Fullerton Byrd, he was one of the first curators of the Smithsonian Institution. He was married to some general's sister in Washington, and he convinced the U.S. Army to train their surgeons who are going out west to be in the Indian Wars and all that kind of stuff, to be natural history people. And their job when they were out there was, of course, to take care of the troops, but they had a lot of time on their hands. And so they were taught how to collect birds and preserve them. They were taught how to collect mammals. And so some of the early ornithologists that were the best ornithologists in the country were actually surgeons in the Army. And so this is Ridgway's Manual of North American Birds, and they started doing really hyper taxonomy. And you go through this book, it's like one of those 3 or 4 inch thick books, and it's just got page after page of here's the toenails of this bird, and here's the beak of this bird, and here's all this stuff. And this is also the day of subspeciation, where they thought there were thousands of birds in the United States because they were splitting them into, every time a bird was slightly different, they'd say, oh, this is a different subspecies. And it was shotgun ornithology. Field glasses weren't very good back then. And so this is actually a Flint Block gun. And this is the kind of gun that John James Audubon and Alexander Wilson were hunting with. And so, they would shoot the bird, they would pose it. You had to have it posed so they could draw it. And that was the way ornithology was proceeding. This is a Parker Brother gun from the 1870s, and it's no longer a flintlock. It's a percussion cap. And it's also, it breaks in the middle, and you can, the top one, you had to put down the powder, and then you put down the ball, and you use the powder horn, and it was really slow. And these things, they actually use, modern day bullets. And this gun is called a Flaubert, and it's a little parlor shooting gun. It shoots caps, and they're about 22 caliber, but they were real quiet. And so this is a gun that a lot of the plume hunters use because they could go into the colony, they could get right up to a bird, they could shoot it. It didn't scare everybody away. And so this was a very popular gun for some of the people that were wiping out wading birds. And then this little pocket pistol is just a portable hunting gun. And then, like Herbert Stoddard from Tall Timbers used to carry one because he worked for museums too. And it had a 410 barrel on top, which is a shotgun, and it had a 22 caliber, which is a bullet. And so it was a versatile gun, and you could pull out the stock, and the 410 barrel that you could shoot slugs out of, and they said you could kill a bear with it, but I wouldn't try it. But anyway, more about these guns than you might think, because here is the Flintlock, and this is the same model. This gun was made by a guy who died in England in the year 1800. So this is the same kind of gun that Audubon and Wilson were shooting, and we have 3 different phrases that come from it. So this area, this mechanism is called the lock. And of course, here's the stock and there's the barrel. So when you talk about lock, stock, and barrel, that saying came from this gun. And right here, you can see this hole. The way this gun would fire is you'd put a flint in there, it would hit that thing and it'd make a flash, and then you'd put your gunpowder in here. And when it flashed, it would go through that hole and it would light the gunpowder in the chamber and shoot the gun off. But if you clicked and it lit off the pan and it flashed, but it didn't go off, what were you? Flash in the pan. Nothing happened. And then also these triggers, you can cock them back halfway and they'll just sit there and you can't pull the trigger and fire them. And when you're ready to shoot it, you pull them out all the way back and then they'll fire. And so going off half cocked means you're not ready to shoot. So there's three different phrases coming from these old flintlock guns. Okay, so I'm going to kind of transition into some of the plume hunting and some of the problems. And so this guy, J.H. Batty, what a character. And he's a real person. And this is obviously kind of a staged, goofy picture, but I'll talk about him in Florida's history. One thing he did is he wrote this book called Practical Taxidermy and Home Decoration in 1880. And it was actually a pretty good book, but he was trying to tell people, oh yeah, I'll teach you how to stuff birds. And he had this phrase in there. He said, what fireplace mantle isn't more beautiful with a pair of Baltimore Orioles mounted on the end of it? And so this is a whole book about how to shoot birds and mammals and how to mount them and make taxidermy. And it's a pretty interesting book, and it's a pretty competent book. And he even has parts in there about what kind of guns to use for what kind of game, and how big of a wood lot you need next to your house to make it through the winter, so you don't freeze to death. He also made these gunpowder holders as a business. So one of the things he did was he had time and he collected birds, and he made this actually pretty competent book. And so this was in the mid to late 1800s, and the plume birds were getting slaughtered and they were making hats out of them. It was a big millinery trade. And so there was a guy named W.E.D. Scott, and he was at Princeton, and he came down to Florida in the 1860s, right after the Civil War. And he went around through Florida Bay and documented these massive colonies of plume birds. When we had 1 million or 2 million, we don't really know exactly how many, but just these astonishingly large colonies. And he wrote about it in the ornithological journals because he was a scientist. And when he got around to Fort Myers, he heard that there was a market hunter who was on the edge of town and who was shooting plume birds. They not just wading birds, but they would shoot terns and ducks and shorebirds, and they just shot everything. And he went out there to meet the guy to find out what he was doing. And it was Joseph Batty. And Batty told him he had 60 gunners along the Gulf Coast who were shooting birds and sending them to him. And then he'd send them up to New York, and they would be made into hats and things like that. And when W.E.D. Scott was there in the his first trip, he didn't meet Batty. His second trip, 20 years later, he did meet Batty. And when he went around the Everglades 20 years later in the 1880s, the plume colonies were gone. They were all shot out. In just 20 years, the Florida hunters went in there and just shot pretty much all the birds. And so he wrote that up and he reported it to the ornithologist. He said, the birds in Florida are just getting slaughtered. They're disappearing. And, that was back when passenger pigeons were disappearing and bison were disappearing. And so Americans were coming to the realization you can't just plunder everything. So there became a big sympathy that, we should stop just killing all these things for the heck of it. And so this is, I'll talk about Frank Chapman in a minute. He was a very famous ornithologist. He was important in starting the Audubon Society, but he wrote a field guide, and I just wanted to point out this part of the field guide down here. This is his scientific description of the snowy egret. The curse of beauty has numbered the days of this, the most dainty and graceful of herons. 20 years ago, it was abundant in the South. Now is the rarest of its family. The delicate aigrettes, which it donned as a nuptial dress, were its death warrant. Women demanded from the bird its wedding plumes, and man has supplied the demand. The Florida herons have gone, and now he is pursuing the helpless birds to the uttermost parts of the earth. Mercifully, they are shot down at their roosts or nesting grounds. The coveted feathers are stripped from their backs. The carcasses are left to rot, while the young in the nest above are starving. But then, the little bunch of aigrettes in yonder jaunty bodice is so pretty, so becoming. I mean, he was really mad. And so he didn't write scientifically about this bird. He just said, we're killing these birds. We need to stop it. And so in the 1890s, there was a guy named George Byrd Grinnell, and he was the editor of Forest and Stream, which is now Field and Stream. And he started an Audubon Society, and he named it after Lucy Audubon because when he was a kid, Audubon's widow tutored him. And so he just made a society that was kind of being appreciative of birds, and it was mostly for children. And he started sending out leaflets. And within 4 years, he had like 50,000 kids subscribed to his leaflets. And it just became too much for him. And so he stopped. And so that was the very first time there was an Audubon Society, and it was extremely popular. And so now I'm going to talk a lot about Chapman. I already mentioned him. He's the one that wrote the Snowy Egret narrative, and then T. Gilbert Pearson. And Chapman was a scientist at the American Museum of Natural History, and I'll come back to him a bunch. Pearson was really the first president of Audubon. He was actually the second president, but our first one, William Dutcher, had a stroke shortly after he took the job. And he lived for about another 8 to 10 years, and they had such respect for him. He had the title of Audubon president even when he had a stroke and he wasn't able to do anything. But Pearson was the acting director. So I'll talk about some of the efforts of these guys to try to help the birds. And Chapman, we just did the Christmas bird count. Frank Chapman started those. So first thing that they're trying to do is pass laws. And so there's a long history of trying to pass laws to protect different things. And even in the 1600s and in New England, people were trying to pass laws to protect wildlife. The big thing that happened was the Aou Model Law. When they first started trying to make American bird protection laws, they would say, okay, don't shoot this and this and this and this. But everybody had different names for birds. And so you couldn't go arrest someone for shooting a cardinal because they didn't shoot a cardinal, they shot a redbird. And so it didn't work very well to try to have a list of things you can't do. So the AOU, the American Ornithological Union, which Chapman was part of, they realized that, look, there's only a few things that people really hunt, and it's waterfowl, and then the grouses and quail and turkeys. And so let's just say, we're going to name the things you can hunt, and you can't hunt anything else, nothing else. Any other bird that's not on this list to hunt, you're not going to be able to hunt it. And so that was called the AOU Model Law. And in 1901, Florida adopted the Audubon Model Law. And so the Audubon societies were the ones that got our modern game management structure set up. Audubon did that. We're the ones that set up the hunting structure that we have in North America now. And the states were adopting these laws, the federal government wasn't, and they didn't until the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was passed in 1918. So Audubon was pushing states to do this, and then after enough time, the states all kind of told the federal government, you guys need to start helping too. And one of the things that really surprised me was Pearson came to Florida and he wrote, oh, I went to Florida and I got the model bird law passed. And then I went to North Carolina, I got the model bird law passed. And then I went to Virginia, and then I went to, and I was thinking, how can this nerdy guy just go to a state legislature and say, we're going to tell all your people in your state to quit shooting birds? How could you convince people like that? Well, anyway, Leslie Kemp Poole wrote this wonderful book called Saving Florida: Women's Fight for the Environment. And it was women. Basically, the women of the early Audubon movement, Massachusetts Audubon had one of the first Audubon societies, and Clara Domerich founded the Florida Audubon Society. If you've been to Orlando on Domerich Drive, that was her husband that was a very wealthy farmer and industrialist. Her original board had the Florida governor on it. Well, his wife, and Teddy Roosevelt was an honorary member, and you read her board of directors that they founded in 1900, and it was just a who's who in Florida. And so when Pearson got to Florida, these wives, they couldn't work, they couldn't vote, but they were educated and they were smart and they had connections. And so they had the greases or the skids greased, and all Pearson had to do is show up, and all the guys in the legislature voted for it. So it really was women who were the main force behind this. And even though they didn't have a lot of social power, they could rely on their connections with their husbands and that. So go girls. And here's a joke in one of the ornithological journals of Frank Chapman arriving with his army of women. And you can see her chewing out this little boy for shooting all these birds. So anyway, women. And this wasn't just going on in America. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds was having the same type of problem over in England. Not only they were making clothes out of plume birds, but they were bringing back these sailing ships with birds of paradise and all kinds of stuff. And so there was a big protection of animals movement going on around the beginning of 1900. And just to bring this full circle, here's the signature on these skins. Ann Paul got these for her bird history display over at the Tampa History Museum. But this bird was shot by W.E.D. Scott, Panosofsky Lake, Florida. And when he was at Panosofsky Lake, which is over near Tampa, he shot 40 snail kites, and he had them stuffed and sent up to the museum. So even though he also was the one that documented the plume birds the most thoroughly and their destruction, he also was down here shooting birds and taking back skins too. Oh, and one more thing, just to close up on Joseph Batty. The reason the American Museum of Natural History had a picture of him is they hired him. They actually hired him and they sent him to South America. I guess they figured he was a pretty good hunter, and he sent back thousands of bird and mammal specimens. And while he was down there, he apparently had a gun accident and killed himself. And so they wrote an obituary about him, and they said, well, he was a great guy. We liked him, and he was in the unfortunate plume bird business, but he did a lot of good for science and it too. And so again, this mix of scientists and poachers and plume hunters, and they were all kind of the same people. They all knew each other. And of course, it wasn't just plume hunting, it was market hunting. If you're going to go shoot ducks for your family, you shoot 3 or 4 and you go home. If you're shooting them to sell them at market, you shoot as many as you can. And so they had all these great big boats, and we were trying to get that stuff outlawed too, because waterfowl populations were having trouble. This old guy called this gun his headache gun. He said he took 2 aspirins before he fired it, and then 2 after, because it's shoulder fire, and 2 aspirins after. But anyway, so this was one of the other things that was going on in America that we were trying to get stopped. And the other movement was not only we wanted people to stop killing birds, but the useful birds, the economic value of birds by Frank Chapman, Birds in Florida. This is from the Department of Agriculture. And people were trying to say, hey guys, birds eat bugs. You guys had a caterpillar thing from Deborah Green, and you probably got a pretty strong impression of how strong birds are on suppressing bugs. And so they tried to talk about why birds are useful and why you shouldn't be shooting them. Farmers would shoot hawks because they kill chickens, but they also kill rats that eat your crops. And so they were trying to get people to realize that. And so just one more rant from Frank Chapman. He talks about, of these birds, herons, egresses, ibis, spoonbills, the state of Florida once possessed a marvelous store, but be it said to Florida's everlasting disgrace that until the honorable industry of shooting birds at their nests became no longer profitable, she raised no hand to save herself from being despoiled of this rich heritage. Even then, the passage of laws was secured only through influence from without, which is partly having Pearson come down here. But the laws, however, were not observed, and all efforts to secure conviction under them failed. So he was really railing against this slaughter of wildlife, as a lot of Americans were. And here's this marker's been washed away, but since we passed the law, no one was enforcing it. So Audubon actually hired wardens, and the state would deputize them, give them a badge and a gun, and they'd go out and enforce game laws. And Guy Bradley got killed in the Everglades by plume hunters. Columbus McLeod got killed at Charlotte Harbor by somebody, but they never found his body. Our warden on Orange Lake up near Gainesville got shot, but he didn't die. And a warden in South Carolina got killed too. So really rough and tumble stuff trying to protect birds from slaughter. And this is just funny because this is Paul Kreugel. He was the first warden at Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge, and I forget where it is. Oh yeah, here's his salary, $1 per month. So anyway, not a high-paying job. And this is the diorama at Pelican Island. And the guy who made this diorama was Frank Chapman. And Frank Chapman was one of the people who told Teddy Roosevelt, hey, let's start making wildlife refuges. Let's start protecting places. You're the president. You can do this. So the National Wildlife Refuge also got founded from pressure from these Audubon scientific related people. But Chapman wasn't perfect either. This is when he was on the Sebastian River and the Carolina parakeets were there. And he said, let's see, and eating seeds in the milky stage. About 10 o'clock, they return to the hummock and apparently to some favorite tree, here to pass the rest of the morning and early afternoon, when they again started out to feed, returning to the roost just before sunset. A flock of these birds feeding among the thistles is the most beautiful and animated sight. One is almost persuaded not to disturb them. There is constant movement as they fly from plant to plant, or when securing thistles, they fly with them in their bills to a neighboring tree, there to dissect them at their leisure. The loud rolling calls apparently uttered only on the wing, but when at rest or feeding, there was a loud conversational murmur of half-articulate querulous notes and call. So he just thought, these birds were beautiful. And here's specimens that were shot on the Sebastian River by Frank Chapman. So again, part of the reason he shot him, and he even wrote in his notes that he felt really bad because by this time they were almost gone. But he also said, they're all going to be gone, and we've got to get specimens. And so he called them feathered documents. And in that sense, they still are here where they would have been gone otherwise. But again, this is that mix. And make no mistake, the number of birds that market hunters and plume hunters shot was way, way more than all the scientists combined. But the scientists were out there doing this too. And if you go to the Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park, there's a statue to the Carolina parakeet. And Todd McGreen did 5 of these statues and he put them at the very last spot that they were ever seen. And one of them's the auk, and one of them's the passenger pigeon, and one of them's the Labrador duck, and one of them's the heath hen. And he just now did one for the Eskimo curlew, which is down in Texas. So if you get to the preserve, you can see this statue. It's the only one in the whole country because the last Carolina parakeet seen at Kissimmee Prairie was seen at Kissimmee Prairie. And here's Chapman's field guide to the birds. How do you figure out what their toes look like? You shoot them. And so this was back when they were still shooting them. And this was 1895. And this was bothering the ornithologists too, because they're like, do we have to shoot a bird every time we want to tell what it is? And so in 1903, he actually made a bird guide, and he made one of the first color bird guides where you could actually recognize birds. And he was trying to get people to quit shooting birds and quit make it so bird watching wasn't killing, it was just watching. And that's, part of the Christmas bird count. And remember I talked about the hypertaxonomy? There's the Florida yellowthroat, Pacific yellowthroat, northern yellowthroat, salt marsh yellowthroat, Belding yellowthroat. So when these guys cataloged their birds, they had like thousands of species because they broke individual species up. Every single variation was a new species. So that was kind of a funny thing about these old bird books. But anyway, they were trying to change the culture even of the scientists. And again, women, birds through an opera glass, quit shooting them, let's start looking at them. And so Howell, in his Florida Bird Life, in 1932, wrote about the long and unremitting but finally triumphant struggle of the National Association of Audubon Societies for the rescue from extinction of the plume birds of Florida. Presents a record probably unparalleled in the animals of conservation. No organization has ever encountered more disappointments and more bitter discouragement in its efforts, and none has ever overcome them with more splendid success. By the 1930s and 40s, the plume birds were rebounding, and a lot of the waterfowl in North America had rebounded too. That once we stopped shooting them, they started building their populations back up. And so back in the 18 and 1900s, the main threat to birds was shooting. And when we got that more or less under control, the birds started recovering. So now we're going to kind of start going to the Okeechobee program. This is a picture of me in 1938. My name's Marvin Chandler. I'm the very first Audubon warden on Lake Okeechobee. The second belt buckle here is my badge. This one, that's the badge. And he was out on Lake Okeechobee with the Crookshanks, and they were filming glossy ibises because at that time, 90% of the glossy ibises in North America were nesting on Lake Okeechobee. And this is a water moccasin that they couldn't get around on the trail. And they opened it up, and in its stomach, it had a glossy ibis egg, 3 tricolored heron eggs, an unidentified egg that had been digested, a baby American egret, and an adult glossy ibis. So anyway, so Audubon, the governing cabinet declared 2 areas of Okeechobee's marsh as Audubon sanctuaries. They still are extant. They're more symbolic now than they were, because I don't enforce laws. I just advocate for the health of the lake. But we were making sanctuaries all over the state to try to protect not only the birds from shooting, but to protect their habitats and their rookeries. And here is Marvin's boat. I can't imagine going out on Okeechobee with a pole boat. We have an airboat now. And here they are out there with their photography equipment. That's Alan Cruikshank. And there's a glossy ibis. And nowadays, there's glossy ibises all over the interior. I see them by the hundreds in farm fields. But back then there were only about 1,500. So another conservation success. And when they set up the sanctuaries, even from Okeechobee City, 5 people from Okeechobee City said, we value the business which the society brings to our community. And, this is Cowtown Central. We believe in the work of society and wish to cooperate with it. So when I first started working for Audubon in Okeechobee, I didn't really realize the history that Chandlers had in the community, and everybody liked Audubon. I was really confused. I'm like, how would all these rural agricultural people like Audubon? But it's because the Chandlers had been there working with people and saying, we're going to do common sense stuff to protect our birds. We'll still hunt and let people fish, but we're going to not overdo it. And so here's one of the things Marvin was up to. These are all eggs, and they were collected for Charles Doe in 1930, and this is near the town of Bassinger. And what had happened is Doe had gotten crossways with the people that he asked to collect eggs with, and they apparently threatened to kill him if he ever came back. So he quit coming back. So Marvin found out about this can of eggs that was never collected. And here's Doe in front of the Doe collection. And so he had all these eggs up in Gainesville, and the Chandlers really didn't like him collecting eggs. And so they were trying to stop him. And so here's Rod Chandler looking up a cabbage tree in a hammock, and here's what he's looking at. So what's that? This is a perennial Karakira nesting tree. And so what Doe did was he actually left the spikes in the tree so he could come out and climb up there. So what Marvin did was he climbed up the tree and stamped the eggs property of the National Audubon Society. So he couldn't go put them in his collection, because then they would say, like, how do you have National Audubon's eggs in your collection? So this was still going on in the 30s in Florida. And here's the Nicholson brothers. They actually were excellent ornithologists, but they were still kind of shooting and egg collecting. And so the Chandlers were trying to dissuade them too. Here's Marvin's 4-wheel drive. Okay, so Marvin died of tuberculosis in 45. And so his nephew, Glenn Chandler, took over. And again, these are local people that Audubon hired to enforce game laws. And so Glenn didn't write a whole lot, but he and Sam Grimes found the first cattle egret nest on Lake Okeechobee. And when Roger Torrey Peterson was on Lake Okeechobee in 1953, and so I got his account because I wanted to hear what the lake looked like. And all he could write about was how fabulous it was to see the glorious cattle egret on its nest and flying around the neighborhood. And I'm like, anyway, so appreciate cattle egrets. And then after Glenn quit, his brother Roderick Chandler took over. And so here he is with Noel Snyder, who wrote the Carolina Parakeet book in the Fort Drum Swamp in 1980. And they were trying to see if they could still find a parakeet somewhere. So again, the third Chandler in this long list. I've been with Audubon a long time, but it's kind of novel not to have a Chandler family member being the Audubon representative. And so when they would ride around up on the prairies, all these pink dots were the Chandlers, and they documented these different wading bird rookeries. And with the Kissimmee River restoration, the Water Management District was trying to plot what we knew, and a lot of it was these old warden reports. And not coincidentally, this was the Kissimmee Prairie Audubon Sanctuary that Rod Chandler helped us pick out when he convinced us to buy it. And so here's the dry prairie. Here's the Kissimmee Prairie. A lot of the locals don't appreciate it very much, but they don't quite realize the treasure that it is. This big dark spot is a tree. It's a runner oak tree, and the prairie burns so often that you can't run a trunk up. You'll get killed by the fire. So what the tree does is it branches out below the surface and sends up expendable stuff. And these trees may cover hundreds of acres, and they may be thousands of years old. We haven't aged these, but some of the oak trees that grow like this out west turn out to be really ancient organisms. So this is actually in a lot of these grass clumps, they can be 100 years old. Palmettos can be thousands of years old. So this is an old growth ecosystem. It's just short. And here's the Kissimmee Prairie from the air. I mean, like, see this big clump right here? That's probably one palmetto plant. It might be two, but they're big. But this is the grasslands. And part of the reason Audubon was up there was these 5 endemic prairie birds: the Florida sandhill crane, the Florida mottled duck, the Florida grasshopper sparrow, burrowing owl, and Audubon's crested Karakira. And so this is another part of the legacy of Audubon is not only we worked on Okeechobee, but we've been working in the Kissimmee Valley to try to protect the bird life. And so in 1970s, Rod Chandler told Audubon, hey, you know, we're plowing the prairies under. And if we're going to save dry prairie, Audubon needs to buy some. And he ended up getting us to buy the Kissimmee Prairie Sanctuary here in Okeechobee County, which was 7,000 acres. And a lot of stars aligned. Part of the money we got to buy it, it was called the Ordway Battelle Kissimmee Prairie Sanctuary. And Catherine Ordway's foundation would match funds. And it was being run by this guy, Richard Poe. And he wrote these other books when he was working for Audubon, but then he went to become the head of Nature Conservancy. And so he was down in Okeechobee in the 1940s, and he was going on these bird tours, and he knew all about the bird life of the prairies and stuff. And so when Rod was trying to get it bought, this is Nat Reed, who of course was very famous and influential. And he told Nat, you know, he said, Nat, we need to buy some. And so Nat went to Dick Poe and said, hey, you know, if we can get a match from Audubon, can we buy the prairie? And so they did. They got the Wattell Foundation. And so that helped us buy the first tract of dry prairie that was bought in Florida for the purpose of saving Florida. And this is just a little letter from Dick Poe. We had to write him and say, hey, after we bought the sanctuary, then we've got the Kissimmee Prairie Preserve bought, and then we sold the sanctuary to the state to be part of the preserve. And we had to write him a letter and say, is that okay with you? And he wrote back to Nat, and it's hard to read, but he said, I will feel that the Good Hills grant was the key to what is now a 50,000 acre preserve. And it really was. You know, this is synergy, and it's building on previous efforts. And so here was the original Audubon Sanctuary. We got this big tract here bought. That was the biggest tract of dry prairie, and that was 2002. And if you look at this area now, notice the southern border of the preserve. Now we just bought the Corrigan property. This is the Triple Diamond. We just bought that. There's a conservation easement here. This is the DeLuca property that goes all the way up to Yeehaw Junction. This is the Adams Ranch. And so out of this one little acquisition, we've been able to piece together a lot of conservation land in the Kissimmee Valley. And this is just like really exciting to see this happening, because as you guys know, development's just gobbling up Florida. And the more we can do to try to lock these lands up in green space and where they can be water management features and habitat features. And some of them, like DeLuca, is still going to be grazed. It's still going to have cows on it, but it's also going to have wetlands and birds and other natural features on it that they're going to be good for the future of Florida. And then, of course, Lake Okeechobee. Here's a snail kite flying over Eleochris. And there's just clickbait. This is Max Stone, that he baited these kites in with these exotic snails and waited for like 4 days for them to finally come over and eat some, but he had his cameras all set up and just got these remarkable photos. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about birds. All these little beauties were banded on Lake Okeechobee. And of course, you've recognized them. They're mostly warblers, neotropical migrants. And these also, this is from Tyler Beck from FWC. He was banding them out there. And he had a couple of them that came back the second year in the same month, because birds are just like us. When you travel to a town that you know a good restaurant, you go back to it. And so when they got to Okeechobee and they found enough bugs, they came back to it. And remember that when they leave Florida, you know, they're going across the Gulf of Mexico, and they do it by doubling their body weight and with fat, and that's their gas tank, and they fly all the way across the ocean. And it's really important for them to be able to have that fat, be able to burn it as they fly. And so it's really important for when they get to Florida, we got to take care of them and make sure that they have plenty of food to get on their journey. And this is part of what you get. These are midges. They just absolutely cover this vegetation. And if the bird arrives and you have this type of healthy habitat with lots and lots of bugs, they get fat in a hurry and off they go. But if we sterilize our lakes with pollution and deep water and things like that, then this effect doesn't happen. And so it was funny that Deborah Green gave you guys a talk, because she probably talked about this, that in Missouri, they put some tents over trees. You know, we all like birds because they're pretty and they sing, but they're useful. And in the trees that had the tent, they started getting caterpillar outbreaks and other bugs, and they lost 25% of their leaves. And the ones in the forest right next to them were only losing 13%. And that extra loss of leaves actually significantly slowed down their growth. And so if you're a forester in Pennsylvania or New Brunswick, You may not know it, but you care if the Everglades is restored and protected, because your birds are going to get to Florida, or not all of them, but a lot of them, and they're going to have to get across the ocean. And if Florida is a mess and they can't get food, they can't make it across the ocean. And we're also the first gas station when they come back. So, and this type of experiment has been replicated all over the place, and the results sometimes are just startling, how much impact birds have on bug populations, and how much they protect us. So again, they're helping us. And of course, here's that neck of the funnel effect of Florida. And here's a map that looks at important migratory areas in both spring and fall. Look at Florida. I mean, we're a hot spot for birds. We have a bigger responsibility than most people. And look at how big of an area that birds migrate out of. I mean, we're serving these massive areas of bird populations, and we're a focal point. But here's what we've done to Peninsular Florida. Here's all of our canals and structures and Everglades. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these changes, because what happened is the wading birds rebounded, but then they crashed again. And the first time they crashed was because of hunting. The second time because of habitat loss and habitat degradation. And so what we did was we had the Everglades flowing like this, and the engineers said, well, let's drain the state. We'll run the water east and west, and then the Everglades don't get enough water. And that's part of the reason why we've lost half the Everglades, but we've lost 90% of the birds, because the remaining Everglades don't work right because they don't have enough water. And we're going to try to, and the same with Okeechobee, and we're going to try to send that water back south, and we're going to try to quit dumping it east and west. And of course, you guys have heard about the roaring algae blooms on Lake Okeechobee. We've got way too much pollution in it. So when it's all lit up like this, that's bad for fish and for birds. And if your dog drinks it, they can kill them. And so we've got to clean that pollution up too. And these are signs. This is the Martin County Health Department on the St. Lucie. This is Lee County over here. And, you know, if you're the Chamber of Commerce, this is not the sign you want on your boat ramps in Florida. I mean, we want people to come to Florida and go fishing and swimming and bird watching and enjoy the water and not have to be afraid of it or get harmed by it. So this is the new threat. It's not hunting so much anymore. It's what we've done to Florida. And you get jokes like this, and, you know, it's kind of funny, but it also makes me really sad, because we have this big special lake. And, you know, when you go out on it, there's crappie fishing and beautiful flats, and these are coots feeding on the SAV. This is all underwater right here. This is the submerged aquatic vegetation, just this incredible resource. And we're not doing well enough to protect Lake Okeechobee. And that's a huge part of my job, is to try to get us back to having the lake more like this most of the time, rather than this stuff is all gone right now because of the recent deep water. And we can't grow it back till we get the water levels down. So how are we going to do it? First thing you got to do is you got to store water outside the lake. When it rains, instead of all the water glugging into the lake and making it harmfully deep, and then we dump it, we got to catch the water in the watershed so that the water slowly goes to the lake doesn't get too deep and cause the harm. And then when you've caught it, you have a chance to clean it before moving it on. If it's just sitting there, you can clean it. And then since we have it under control, we can convey it south to the Everglades where it's needed. And so they're building reservoirs along the Caloosahatchee River. They're building them on the St. Lucie River. So when water goes this way and this way, we can buffer the estuaries from harmful releases. And we can also leak a little bit of water out of the lake, although mostly they're going to catch their own local basin runoff. And we're building facilities north of the lake to try to slow the water down, like I was talking about. And then this is down south of the lake. They're going to build a big reservoir right here that is going to be a pop-off valve. And the lake gets too deep, instead of sending it east and west, we can send it south. And this is Everglades restoration. These reservoirs are massive. They're 20, 30 square miles, some of them. And so it takes a long time. It costs a lot of money. But if we don't do this, you know, Florida's not going to be what we want it to be in the future. And here's the river, Kissimmee River, channelized. And they filled in the channel. You can see the old channel right here. And look at this. This water's moving slow. It's not glugging into Lake Okeechobee. It's getting cleaned by all the plants. And so this was an ecological restoration project, but it's also helping us with Okeechobee and trying to clean up the water and slow it down. And so this is we need to start doing this all over our watershed. And this is the river, if you build it, they will come. So we know how to do it. We just have to keep the political will going. And So I don't argue about shooting as much anymore as habitat. And this is the way we used to make citrus, and there's no room for wildlife or water storage or anything there. And this is a more modern grove where we're still growing stuff for people, but we leave the natural features. And when I talked to This Is Likes Brothers, I said, that's really great. And they said, well, what we learned is this is a low spot, whether you drain it or not, it's still a low spot. When it rains, all the water runs in it. And by the time we get it out, the trees get harmed. And so rather than fight it, we'll just leave it. We'll let it be part of our grazing routine and living with nature rather than trying to subjugate it. And here's a working cattle ranch. You can see the cows back here. And look at it, it has a wetland, has birds in it. So why can't, if we're going to spend money to build big reservoirs, why can't we pay private landowners and say, hey, if we pay you to plug your ditch, will you do it? And when it rains, instead of the water running off your property, it'll just sit there. We don't have to turn on a pump. We don't have to do anything. It creates habitat. And so those projects have started going on. Now, this is one as part of the Indian River Lagoon South, but here's a drained area in the Indian River Lagoon area. And they went in and plugged the ditches and the water's sitting there. It's just sitting there. So, these projects have downstream water management benefits. They have wildlife benefits. They give landowners an extra source of income. And I think, the more we can do this in Florida and try to get our watersheds back to what they used to be and not the mess that they are now, the better off we'll be. And so that was kind of a whirlwind tour of ornithology, but I'll close it with a quote from Rod Chandler, who's one of my heroes. And he was a cracker. So his writing, all the spellings and everything is his. But he says, I know one thing for sure. I'm always closer to God while checking the Everglades kites with the airboat than most any other time. And I am always thankful to him when I get back to the landing, because if you know airboats, they're very unreliable. So anyway, thanks for listening, everybody. And I'll be happy to entertain any questions or whatever you guys have.
Hey, Paul, thank you so much for a great presentation. It was chock full of information.
So I talk fast enough.
It was great. I do want to give a shout out. There is a Linda Cooper that said hello, and Paul Miller. They said hello, and Edward McEwen from Palm Bay. Thanks for joining us, guys, and glad to have you here. And so now I have questions for you.
Okay.
Anybody, if you do have questions, you could type them in the chat now, but I was writing lots of notes.
Yeah, and Linda and Paul both have been very involved with the Kissimmee Prairie, so it's great to hear from them.
Excellent. Great to have you here too. And let's see. So lots of questions, but one of the first ones is, the one slide you had, and it showed Audubon's great big book, and it looked like it was under glass. Is that open to the public in a museum now?
Yes, it is. And that was from a museum, and I forget what museum it is. I'm sorry, I Googled that up. But I think if you just look for it, you can find it. And there was a traveling museum exhibit that was in West Palm for a while, that they had all the plates out of his book, and they had them mounted, and you could go in and look at all of them in a gallery. So there are opportunities to find it. I just can't tell you right away where they are.
Okay, no worries. And I thought it was very interesting where there was that competition between Wilson and Audubon. And would you say that when you mentioned Wilson and he was showing the tail because he was more of a scientist, you said, than an artist, was Audubon doing the same thing to show the difference for identification? Or overall, would you say his was more from an artistic approach?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was much more artistic. And so Wilson, he put out his book about 1810 to 1814, and Audubon put his out like 1830. So he came along later. Wilson was dead and gone. But what Audubon did was he took his portfolio to Philadelphia, which was the center for intellectual America. There's a lot of scientists and rich people there. And he went to the Philadelphia Academy of Sciences, and especially a guy named George Ord, who was Wilson's friend, was one of the prominent people in the Philadelphia Academy, and he didn't like the competition. And Ord just hated Audubon, and more or less they ran him out of town on a rail. They said, your drawings aren't good. And he talked to Wilson's the guys who helped him do his engravings, and they got in arguments about style, and Audubon's like, well, I'm an artist, and so that actually turned out to be good, because when he left Philadelphia, he decided, well, I'm going to go to Europe. And he got to England and they just loved him. He was just a sensation over there. He was a woodsman who could paint beautiful, dramatic paintings. And so he published his books in England. And then when he came back, he had such a triumph in Europe, the Americans had to accept him. But it was it was unfortunate, because he and Wilson actually met once in their life and they had nice conversations, but there was never really competition. It was just the people around Wilson were kind of protective of his stature, and they didn't need to be, but anyway, people.
Very interesting. Okay, I have another question. You showed the picture of the different guns, shotguns and such. And so when they were hunting the birds, did that cause a lot of damage to them?
Yes. So when you shoot something, obviously you're sending projectiles through it. And so sometimes you can actually, break the beak off or something like that. And that's part of what, in Batty's book, he tells about the pellet size to use on different things. If you're shooting a mouse, you don't use a great big bullet. And so they use fine shot on very small birds. But yes, there is the problem where you can mess up things that you want to not mess up, or if they bleed too much, they can stain their plumage or stuff. So yes, that's an issue.
Okay. All right. Now, that one book that you showed by Joseph Batty, The Practical Taxidermy and Home Decoration, I thought that was a funny name of a book. And so growing up, you hear about hunting lodges, maybe they'll have a deer head or something, maybe some waterfowl. But was it actually really common in those days for regular people to have bird displays on their mantelpieces?
Well, it was becoming increasingly common, and that's part of what Batty was trying to do. He had worked as a taxidermist in New York City, and he was trying to convince people to do this. And of course, the plume and animal industries were taking off. If you look at, there was a big fur trade in North America. They're trapping beavers and trapping other things. And oh, what was the name? One of the guys became a billionaire. Well, a millionaire back then, but a billionaire by today's terms. And it's a really famous name, but he was with the Hudson Bay Fur Company. And so there was a lot of reliance on animals for decoration and utility and stuff like that. So that's part of what that book by Batty was about.
Okay, great. I do have some questions in the chat and a couple of comments. And one is, there's a Birds of America you can view in the Small Natural History Museum in Philadelphia. And another comment, water issues. Are you confident we will have enough water for wildlife and for people?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, that's the next thing that almost all my work nowadays is about water. And like for people in the Orlando, Kissimmee area, that region functionally is out of water. Everybody had to slow down pumping the Floridian aquifer because it was dropping, and that's not sustainable. And they expect Orlando to keep growing. And so actually Audubon's working right now on trying to figure out these surface water storage projects that I was talking about at the end that we can do in the Orlando region, where we can help Orlando build projects that will hold water, because Orlando sits at the top of the hill and the water flows either down to St. John's or up to St. John's, down the Everglades, or over to the Gulf Coast. And for you guys to have enough water into the future, you're going to have to start holding it. And if you do hold it, it'll help protect the downstream systems from these big glugs. So it's really an important thing, and we're on a timeline because of the rapidity of growth.
Exactly. Another question is, what's the current status of the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge?
Okay, well, I showed that one that map of the Kissimmee Prairie and how the lands have grown. So we just bought the Corrigan Ranch, and that was like 10 square miles. And they've bought several other properties. I was just out with them this week, some of their staff, and they've got like 20 some thousand acres of fee simple, and the goal was 50. And they also have a lot of conservation easements, and the goal was 100,000. So they're working on it. The funding has been coming pretty well. The state's been cooperating with them in trying to get properties. And so they're working on it really hard, and I help them every way I can.
Great. Thanks for that update. Here is another question. Oh, and that was Larry Rosen that asked those questions. Thank you, Larry. And Paul Miller has a question. How many of the recently conserved dry prairie parcels have grasshopper sparrow populations breeding on them? And how big is Kissimmee Prairie Preserve right now? State park right now.
Okay, so the preserve is like 58,000 acres right now. There's one property, the DeLuca property, that has grasshopper sparrows on it. That's the one that's northeast of the Kissimmee Prairie, and we've known about that for a while, and the private owners would let us work out there, but we couldn't tell anybody where they were. But now that's been donated to the University of Florida, and it will be conserved, and so we're going to work with them. So that's one new subpopulation. Corrigan has Florida grasshopper sparrows on it, so that's another new subpopulation. The Adams Ranch parcel that has an easement, it has or has had grasshopper sparrows very recently. So, when Paul was down here, we only really knew of 3 subpopulations on 3 lakes, Kissimmee Prairie and Avon Park. And now we have like at least 6, and maybe some more. So that really helps us with not having all of our eggs in one basket.
Excellent. And that reminds me, I had previously heard that some of the grasshopper sparrow populations are being decimated due to fire ants. Is that true, or is that contributing?
On the ranch where the habitat's not so pristine, that has been an issue. On 3 Lakes Wildlife Management Area, that has not. It's more snakes. So it's kind of situational. And just for everybody's knowledge, Florida grasshopper sparrows really crashed recently, and we were really scared about them. And we started a captive breeding program, and the partners, the state and the feds, we got a lot of people who are working on it, have released 500 grasshopper sparrows now in the last 3 years, and they survived. And now on 3 Lakes, which had the largest remaining population, something like 60% of all the sparrows out there now have at least one parent who came from a captive flock. So it's been successful so far. We're confident we can let a whole bunch more go and try to reestablish these populations. And so that's been another big conservation effort. And the thing about grasshoppers is all those lands around the Kissimmee Prairie and Avon Park, we have a ton of habitat for them. So it's not like, on Guam, they had a whole bunch of birds go extinct, and because of the brown tree snakes. And I saw a Guam kingfisher in a collection here in Florida. You can't take it back. So even if you could breed it, what do you do with it? But grasshoppers don't have that problem. We have tons of habitat for them. It's waiting for them. So we can rebuild their populations. We'll have a good future for them.
Great. And in the snake problem, are those native Florida snakes, or is it any invasive species that are preying on them?
Yeah, so far it's native snakes, especially corn snakes, and yellow rat snakes. Yeah, well, that's corn snake. Yeah, but it's kind of funny because the researchers, when the sparrow numbers got so low, they actually started putting fences around the nest to try to protect them from snakes. And I thought that was kind of a knuckleheaded idea. I thought it's not going to work, and I was completely wrong. It's more or less doubled nest success in a lot of the populations. So that's been one more thing with them in intensive care. That the researchers have done to help them out.
Awesome, amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, I do have some more questions for you. And I always heard about how the snowy egrets were being used for the plumage and the hats, but were there other species that were focused on, maybe even from Europe or Central or South America, that were disappearing as well?
Right. Yeah. So almost all the herons and egrets in Florida were targeted to some extent. Of course, roseate spoonbills and flamingos. I mentioned the birds of paradise from New Guinea, but there are just a lot of African birds in South. There's all kinds of parrots and macaws and things in South America. So it wasn't just plume birds. In North America, the millinery trade mostly relied on them, but in England, especially, and in Europe, it was a much bigger variety of birds that they were importing.
And do you know, is there an effort to save any of the old hats or clothing that are on display where people can see those birds?
There are some around. I don't know how many there are. And Frank Chapman famously walked down the New York street and saw 30 some species of birds on women's hats in just one morning. So there were a lot of them made, and the millinery trade employed like 10,000 people in New York City. So when we were trying to stop them, they're like, "Hey, you're hurting our economy." And we're like, "Well, you need to find something else to do that's not so destructive of our resources."
Mhm.
Sometimes that's a hard thing to tell people, but
Exactly. All right, another question. There was that man Doe that was collecting all of the eggs. Well, what was the purpose? Was he just had this collection of bird eggs? Did it serve a scientific purpose or like his own museum? Why did he need to collect so many of those eggs?
it's both. Museum people are like hoarders, but it is good to get samples of the different kinds of bird eggs, and there have been studies on different groups of birds like songbirds and penguins and shorebirds and how they lay eggs and how the eggs behave. So it's part of the bird's life history. But then also there was a journal called the Oologist, and it was just about egg collecting. People would do it just for fun, and I had an Australian friend. That was his childhood hobby. He'd go around, get bird eggs, and put them in a box in his bedroom or something. So it's been again, it's kind of a mix between collectors and scientists and poachers and all that.
Wow. Okay. I liked how you mentioned that they were very amazed by seeing the first cattle egret in 1953. Now, as you know, cattle egrets are everywhere, but was it? I heard that they originally naturally came from Africa, and is that true?
Yeah, there's a little bit of debate about it because we don't really have it documented real well, but they are originally apparently an African bird. And I think most people think they got to America naturally. Maybe they got on a hurricane or something and came off Cape Verde or something. They also are in South America, but yeah, you're right. And in the 50s, they had been seen in Florida and they'd seen little flocks of them, 10 and 12. And so they knew that they were nesting somewhere. And it was when they got out in Okeechobee and found that nest that they finally documented that. So that's why Peterson was so excited. It was the first one in North America. So you know how
Okay.
birders are.
Great. A comment of I just didn't realize how much the Chandler family was involved with Audubon. So I think it's great that you have these families that this conservation was very important to them. And I don't think a lot of people know too much about them. So I'm happy that you mentioned them and their efforts.
Well, and I left out Noel, who was Rod's son, who also worked for us. So yeah, they worked for us for like 60 years in Okeechobee County.
Wow, that's
Of
great.
course, they're one of the original settler families, so half the county's related to them.
Wow, excellent. And I never realized when you showed the pictures of those old growth oaks and palmettos, I never even realized that they can grow underground like that and be ancient. So I think more people need to know about that because that's amazing.
Yeah, and the prairie, we think it burns every 1 to 3 years. And so the plants out there have all kinds of strategies where they leave a rich seed bank or they grow underground and some of them won't even flower or bloom unless they get burned in the springtime. So it's very much a fire adapted community, and all of the different things the plants do to get along out there is pretty impressive.
And
And
is there the prescribed burning out there now, or it just naturally
yeah,
burns?
yes, it's a prescribed program. The Florida Park Service is they try to burn it on a 2 year rotation, which means they got to burn 25,000 acres a year, which is 40 square miles. It's really a big job, but they do a great job of it. And it's also going on 3 lakes in Avon Park that in the old days lightning would strike and the fire would burn for days until it reached a river. But nowadays the fire department puts it out. You can't wait for a fire to come by. You've got to start your own, and so they're very good at that.
Excellent. And when you talked about the different areas of the land acquisition, that was great and exciting. And are there any new parcels in the process? I'm not sure if you can talk about that, but are there new tracts right now in the process of being acquired?
Yes. The Florida Forever program has a list of properties, and every year they get their allocation and they try to buy they rank them, the most desirable, either from an ecological standpoint or a size or a location or, some combination. And so they have a list of people waiting to sell their property for conservation. The Rural and Family Lands Program, which is more of a conservation or an agricultural conservation easement, that has a waiting list too. The Headwaters Refuge is actively talking to people. So it's an ongoing thing. And there's the big thing is just getting money. If we can get the money, we've got people lined up.
Excellent. That's great to hear. And great pictures for Tyler Beck. We've previously had him talking about snail kites. So awesome pictures of him banding the birds and then eating the midges. I didn't realize that they focused on midges. So that's a really cool little fact.
Well, they're insectivores, so they eat what they can find, and so when midges are by the billions, then that makes it easy. But they'll eat mosquitoes and beetles and caterpillars and everything else.
Great. My work with the purple martins, we were characterizing their diet and analyzing their poop through genomics, and we found even the purple martins are eating a wide range of pests, agricultural pests, and dragonflies from big to little, even ants, fire ants. So we do have it proven they're eating ants. So it's great to hear that.
That's because fire ants breed 5,000 feet above the surface.
You are correct.
Yeah. Who would think?
Yes. And I did read this one study. It was more out west, but they found that the queens of these fire ants are just so rich in nutrients where they need to forage less if they're focusing on the queens. And so that's great. Great to have the birds here taking care of those pesky ants. Another question about, you showed the picture of Lake O and then different areas of where the water can be held. And are those areas farmland right now? The little parcels to hold the water before they enter Lake O.
Yeah, pretty much all of them are farmland. Because you really can't do that in the middle of the city, obviously. Well, you could, but anyway. But so in the Everglades agricultural area, it's the south end of the EAA where the soil has decomposed and agriculture's gotten very hard. And so the sugar farmers have sold that land because they really don't have a good farming future. On the Caloosahatchee, it's an old citrus grove that's been abandoned, and same with St. Lucie. So those are lands that the citrus was no longer viable and the people were willing to sell. North of the lake, it's been harder because it's these semi-natural ranch lands that has so much ecological value. And that's part of the reason why north of the lake, we're pushing these more natural storages. Let's restore wetlands to the extent we can. We can't restore everything because people are in the way, but we can restore a lot. And then after we do that, there will be some combinations of reservoirs and wells and things like that. But we don't really have a clear picture of what it's going to look like in the end, but we know we have a lot of work to do.
Great. Excellent. And as for Lake O, I'm always interested about invasives. So of course, plants, is there a invasive management issue right now? And are they using mechanical removal or pesticides or herbicides?
Yes to all that. Actually on Lake Okeechobee, they have what they call an interagency task force, and it's the Corps of Engineers, because they have a navigation and water management mission. And if hyacinths float into their structure and plug it and it doesn't work, then that's really serious. They also have a navigation channel across the lake, and you got to keep that open. Then of course, FWC and Water Management District have different ecological goals of keeping out hyacinths and torpedo grass. And so they actually met this morning to talk about some of their management plans. So there's a lot of plant management going on. There's a lot of it's spraying, most of it's spraying. Okeechobee is hard to do mechanical because it's so big. You got to barge stuff for long distances, and there's a lot of controversy over that about what's the best way to do these different things. So they're working right now. FWC is working on a management plan for Lake Okeechobee to try to explain what they're doing and why and how they plan on doing it. So that's a work in play. They're doing it on the Kissimmee chain and the Harris chain too. So I think that'll be an improvement when they get their plans done and we can have a little bit more clarity about what they're doing and what they're trying to do.
Okay, great. And I do have another comment from Linda, and she said, check out the Kissimmee Prairie Friends Facebook page to find out some of the field trips happening there. And so thank you for sharing that, Linda.
Well, Linda is an expert butterfly and moth person, and well, butterflies mostly and skippers. And so she leads some of those tours, and they're just wonderful. And the prairie, thanks to her and Buck, her late husband, has, I think, the longest butterfly list in the state because of all these wildflowers. It's just a magical place.
Excellent.
And she's a better CSO member than I am, because I didn't mention that. So thank you.
And I have one final question. How long, under, I guess, natural conditions, historical conditions, and conditions now, will it take for water to travel from the head of the Everglades down to the Everglades?
Oh, that's okay. So in the good old days, before we dug all the drainage canals, the whole watershed, it's really flat. It's a series of plateaus, and they're all flat. And it would fill up with water, and it would be 6 to 8 months before it drained out. I remember reading about some soldiers in the Second Seminole War in January up in the Kissimmee Valley, in the Kissimmee chain of lakes, and they rode their horses all day and never got out of the water. And that was in January. But now we dug all these drainage ditches, and they're like super highways to get your water out of your neighborhood. And so now, even like after Hurricane Irma, basically most of the gates had closed within 1 month. And in essence, we take 6 to 8 months of water and we slap it in the lake in 1 month. And that's why it goes up so fast. That's why it gets damaged. That's why we dump water. And again, if we start restoring wetlands and holding that water for the 6 months that we would like to hold it, it'll start helping. The water going through the Everglades, I'm not sure how long it took, but it flowed at like a centimeter or a minute or something like that. I mean, it took months to flow through the Everglades. It was a river. And if you look at it really close, you can see the water moving, but it's just so slow. So, and that's what we're trying to do, is slow it back down and keep the water on the land and keep it being habitat and all that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for the program tonight, Paul. Lots of information. I can't wait to go back and listen to some of it again. So thank you for everything you do. You are amazing. The work you do is needed. We appreciate you, and thank you. And for all of our viewers tonight and everyone watching, thank you. We appreciate you. Stay safe. Take care, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you tuning in.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a good night.
All right. Thanks.